In this video, we will be looking at early muscle cars. This will not include pony cars, super stocks, their predecessors, or performance compacts such as the Nova Supersport. Just the mid-sized American performance cars that originated the term, starting with the introduction of the Pontiac GTO in 1964. Pontiac had recently built its reputation around performance models, and GM's ban on factory-backed racing shifted the focus from the track to the street. So using a loophole to work around the 330 cubic inch limit in the mid-size segment, Pontiac dropped the 6.4-liter 389 from the large Grand Prix into the smaller, lighter Tempest body. With the standard 4-barrel, it increased horsepower to 325. The $295 GTO package for the $2,500 Tempest Le Mans also included dual exhaust, bigger springs and front sway bars, improved cooling, an engine dress-up kit, simulated hood scoops, and wider 7.5-inch 14s. Options included tri-power, 3 2-barrel carburetors, bumping horsepower to 348, a 4-speed manual or 2-speed automatic, limited slip, attack, and additional cooling, handling, and brake upgrades. With a quarter mile in the low 14s, the GTO was a second quicker than the 280 horsepower 4-barrel 5.4-liter 326 Le Mans, and with a top speed over 130, it was easily 10 miles an hour faster. Styling was updated for 1965, as was horsepower, now 335 to 360, thanks to new heads and intake. Brakes were improved, and the upgraded shocks and sway bar became standard, and the new hood scoop could be made functional. Although weight was up and torque was down, acceleration remained similar with a slightly lower top speed. Advertising called it the Tiger, but it became commonly referred to as the Goat. Changes for 1966 were relatively modest, outside of it becoming a separate model instead of just being a package. And it was its most successful year, with sales being just below 100,000. In 1967, the engine increased to a 6.6-liter 400, but the tri-power option was discontinued. Horsepower was now 255 to 360, and a 3-speed automatic with a dual-gate his and hers shifter was added to the options list. The cars were restyled for 1968, being 6 inches shorter on a 3-inch shorter wheelbase, using a more rounded semi-fastback body. In spite of an Endura front bumper, weight was still up about 100 pounds. New options included hidden headlights and white wall or radial tires. The powertrain carried over, and standard horsepower was 350. The HO had 360, and the Ram Air 2 366. Performance remained similar, with the quarter mile in the low to mid-14s for the 4-speed, and under 16 for the automatic. And in an age before restrictions on dealer upgrades, Royal Pontiac in Michigan would drop in a 390 horsepower 7-liter 428 for only $650. For 1969, the HO engine was up to 366 horsepower and renamed Ram Air, although it is sometimes referred to as the Ram Air 3. Well, the top engine became the 370 horsepower Ram Air 4, but by this point, many horsepower ratings were questionable for various reasons. There was a new Judge package with a wheel and tire upgrade, spoilers, and graphics, raising the price another $330. A facelift for 1970 included an extended nose, making the car longer overall. The Ram Air 400 became the base engine, while the 7.5-liter 455 became an available option. Although horsepower ratings and overall performance were unchanged, and sales were down to just over 40,000. There was another minor facelift for 1971, and engines were retuned to better run on unleaded fuel. The base 400 was rated at 300 gross horsepower, or 255 net, and the top 455 was rated at 335 gross, or 310 net. But once again, overall performance was little impacted. For 1972, the GTO was once again an options package on the Le Mans, but only on the hardtop coupe. It included fewer features, adding just over $350 to the Le Mans' $2,800 base price. Horsepower was down to 250 to 300 net, but it was still a mid-14-second car with the 4-speed. Sales fell to under 6,000. The Le Mans was restyled for 1973, and the GTO carried on as an option package, still offered with the 400 and 455 engines, now rated at 230 and 250 horsepower, for a mid 15-second quarter mile and speeds around 110 miles an hour. The planned 310 horsepower Super Duty version did not make it into regular production, and sales continued to decline. So for 1974, the GTO became an option package on the compact Ventura. It included heavy-duty suspension with front and rear roll bars and cosmetic upgrades, including wheels and a shaker hood scoop. The 5.8-liter 354 V8 was marketed as a 350 and produced 200 net horsepower for a top speed of 120 and a quarter mile just over 16 seconds. It would be the final year of the original Pontiac GTO, but its initial success inspired others to follow suit, one of the first being the Oldsmobile Cutlass 442, being quicker to market as it was essentially an existing police package. It used the same 5.4-liter 330 cubic inch V8 as other Cutlasses, but with a heavy-duty valve train and a performance cam bumping horsepower to 310. It also included heavy-duty shocks, springs, bushings, control arms, clutch, pressure plate, steering box, and drum brakes. Other features included less restrictive air cleaner, dual exhaust, and 7.5-inch wide redline tires. It could do a 15-second quarter mile and 130 miles an hour, as a $136 package on a car that started around $2,700. Roughly 3,000 were made, including 10 four-door sedans. But Oldsmobile would take advantage of released restrictions for 1965 and moved up to a 6.6-liter 400, increasing horsepower by 25 and torque by 85, which knocked about half a second off the quarter mile time, and sales climbed over 25,000. But it stuck with the 4-barrel 4-speed and dual exhaust that gave it the 442 name, sort of, as it could be ordered with a 3-speed manual or a 2-speed automatic. It was no longer available as a 4-door, but 3 versions of the engine were offered in 1966. A base 350 horsepower version, a W30 package which added a performance cam and cold air induction for 360 horsepower, and a tri-carb version with 3 two-barrel carbs, also providing 360 horsepower, with the W30 reducing the quarter mile to under 14 seconds. GM would ban multiple carburetors for 1967, but the 442 would get an available 3-speed automatic. The cars were restyled for 1968, shorter but heavier, and now considered a separate model, with a new under-square 400 sharing its stroke with the bigger 455, replacing the previous over-square 400. Standard horsepower remained 350 with the manual transmission, but the automatic-equipped cars were reduced to 325, and there was still a 360 horsepower W30 version, with a quarter mile of around 14 seconds. But the 442 was no longer the only Oldsmobile muscle car, with the introduction of the Hearst Olds. Sharing the same body, it was only offered in silver and black and powered by a 390 horsepower 7.5-liter 455, backed by a 3-speed automatic with a Hearst dual-gauge shifter, putting the car in the sub-14-second range. Minor changes for 1969 included a W32, which included the cold air induction without the performance cam, and the Hearst Olds moved to white and gold. For 1970, the 442 moved up to the 455 with 365 horsepower standard, and an optional 370 horsepower W30, which now used functional hood scoops. But the Hearst Olds was gone. Power was down for 1971 to 340 and 350 gross, or 270 to 300 net, still capable of a quarter mile below 14.5 seconds. But for 1972, the 442 became a simple appearance and handling package, using a standard 160 net horsepower 5.7-liter 350, although the 300 horsepower 455 W30 was still optional, and the Hearst Olds returned as an official pace car. The cars were restyled for 1973, and the 442 and Hearst Olds carried over, now in black and gold. The 350 came in 180 to 200 horsepower variants, and the 455 in 250 to 270 horsepower versions, making for a mid-15-second car. For 1974, both cars were offered with an 180 horsepower 350 or 230 horsepower 455. And the big distinction of the Hearst Olds for 1975 would be a T-top, although it would be discontinued after the end of the year. The 442 would carry on, however, with a new NASCAR-inspired aerodynamic front end, and was now available with the full line of Cutlass engines, including a 4.1-liter 250 Chevy straight six and a 3.8-liter 231 Buick V6. Then for 1977, the 455 was dropped, making the top engine an 185 horsepower 6.6-liter 403, and only with an automatic, making it a mid-17-second car, only for the cars to be downsized for 1978, offered as a fastback, and the top engine being a Chevy 5-liter 305 V8, pushing 135 horsepower with the 4-speed and 160 horsepower with the automatic, either doing a 17-second quarter mile. But the Hurst Olds returned for 1979, using the Cutlass Calais's more formal body, and being the only mid-sized GM coupe that year to offer a 350 and 170 horsepower W30 for a 17-second quarter mile, a package that would effectively become the new 442 for 1980, although the 3.8-liter V6 and 5-liter V8 remained available, which seemed to be the final year of the Oldsmobile muscle car, but it would be revived again for 1983, as the Hurst Olds for 83 and 84, now powered by a 5-liter 307 with 180 horsepower, which dropped to 170 horsepower in 1985 when it once again became the 442, lasting through 1987, making it easily the longest running of the original muscle car names, even if the muscle itself had faded. Chevrolet introduced the Malibu Super Sport in 1964, but it wasn't really a performance package. Its primary features included vinyl bucket seats, a center console with floor shifter, and an instrument cluster, costing just over $160 for the package. The standard engine was a 220 horsepower 4.6-liter 283, with an optional 5.4-liter 327 with 250 to 300 horsepower, which would be bumped up to a 350 horsepower version for 1965, a mid-14-second car with a top speed near 140. But the big engine muscle came at the end of the year, with the introduction of the Super Sport 396. The 6.5-liter V8 was offered in 325 to 375 horsepower tunes, moving it into the low 14-second range. The Super Sport 396 would become its own model with the updated styling of 1966, and the basic Malibu Super Sport was dropped, except for in Canada. With the restyle of 1968, a Super Sport 396 started around $2,900, and it was no longer considered a limited edition model. It would soon become an option package costing just over $350, so sales leapt from a few hundred a year to over 60,000, and for that year only could be ordered on the El Camino. But approximately 320 Chevelles were fitted with a 425 horsepower 7-liter 427 as part of GM's Copo Special Order program, including at least 99 Yenko Chevelles. The Chevelle would receive more updates for 1970, including a major facelift. The 396 was replaced by a 6.6-liter 402 with 350 to 375 horsepower, but the package was still marketed as the Super Sport 396. There was also a new Super Sport 454. Its 7.4-liter engine came in 360 horsepower or 450 horsepower LS6 versions, making for a mid-13-second car. The basic Super Sport package returned for 1971 using a 5.7-liter 350 with 245 to 275 gross horsepower, or 165 to 200 net. The Super Sport 396 was only offered with a 300 gross or 260 net horsepower version of the 402, and the Super Sport 454 had 365 gross or 285 net horsepower, still capable of a quarter mile in under 15 seconds. But horsepower would be down again for 1972 to 270. The cars would be restyled for 1973, getting heavier, with the simple SS now being a handling and appearance package. It could even be ordered on the wagon. It could be had with a 350 with 145 to 175 horsepower, or a 454 with 245 horsepower, now a high 15-second car. It would be the last year of the Chevy Malibu Super Sport, but the 454 would last a few more years. The last of the GM cars to enter the muscle car market would be Buick in mid-1965, with the Skylark Grand Sport. It included a 6.6-liter 401 with a heavy-duty radiator and dual exhaust. Marketed as a 400, it produced 325 horsepower and was able to do the quarter mile in under 15 seconds. It would get a styling update for 1966, and in 1967 would be renamed Grand Sport 400 to make room for the cheaper Grand Sport 340, using a 5.6-liter with 260 horsepower, which would be the basis for regional editions, such as the GS California, providing the muscle car look in a more practical package. There was a restyle for 1968, and the packages would be simplified to GS 400 and GS 350, indicating the move to distinct models, and the 5.7-liter with 250 to 280 horsepower, while the GS 400 was up to 340. But that would be replaced in 1970 by the GS 455 with 350 horsepower or a 360 horsepower Stage 1, the Stage 2 being a list of dealer-installed options to increase power. There was also an $1,100 GSX upgrade to the $3,100 GS 455, essentially a handling and appearance package, only offered in yellow or white with black stripes. Well, the 350-powered car was up to 315 horsepower and simply called the GS. But it would once again be a GS 350 for 1971, and horsepower was back down to 260, or 195 net. And the GS 455 was down to 340, or 275 net. But the GSX was now offered in a full range of colors. Then power would drop again for 1972 to 190 for the 350 and 270 for the 455 net. With the restyle of 1973, the Skylark would be renamed Century, but it retained a Grand Sport edition. The 350 came in 150 to 190 horsepower versions, and the 455 in 250 to 270 horsepower versions. The added weight making it a mid-15-second car. The 455 lost power again in 1974, down to 245 to 255, and would then be dropped mid-year 1975, when the base engine for the Grand Sport was a 3.8-liter 231 Buick V6, and the optional 350 V8 was rated at 155 to 175 horsepower, becoming the last Grand Sport for the time being. Ford did things much different, offering several performance packages that often weren't specific to the big engine versions, unless you count the Thunderbolt, a mid-size superstock for 1964. Technically a homologation special, these Fairlanes with a modified 7-liter 427 wedged into them were very much not road cars. But 1966 added a couple of sporty packages, which included the Extra Lively, or XL, that provided no actual performance, just things like bucket seats and white wall tires, and could be had with any engine. The actual performance package at the time was the GT and GTA, which started with a 335 horsepower 6.4-liter Thunderbird 390, with the GTA adding a Sport Shift Cruise-O-Matic. The 4-speed GT was a high 14-second car with a top speed over 115 miles an hour. Ford also offered a 7-liter 427 as an option, but only in the base Fairlane 500, and only 57 were made. It was rated at 425 horsepower, and only available with the 4-speed, making for a low 13-second quarter mile. For 1967, it could be combined with the XL package. The cars got a restyle for 1968 that included a fastback. The top models became Torinos, which is where the GT and GTA packages landed, which were available with GT Performance suspension and GT stripes and a hood scoop. But they moved to a standard 4.9-liter 302 with 210 horsepower, making the 390 the option, as was the new 428 Cobra jet that replaced the 427. Marketed as having 335 horsepower, many considered it underrated, but it moved the car to a high 14-second quarter mile, and was soon offered as the only engine in the Cobra, essentially the same car, but with more subdued trim and fewer features, sometimes referred to as either the Fairlane Cobra or the Torino Cobra. It was badged as neither. And in 1969, the GT would get an available 5.8-liter 351 Windsor with 250 to 290 horsepower, and being a mid-15-second car. There was also a limited Torino-Talladega Aero package for the year, developed for NASCAR, with just over 750 made. They would be restyled once again for 1970. The 390 was gone, but a 351 Cleveland was added, providing 300 horsepower, and the 428 would be replaced by a 429 Cobra Jet, with 360 to 370 horsepower, which was now the engine that came in the Cobra, with a similar high 14-second quarter mile and 135 mile-an-hour top speed to the outgoing model, in spite of the weight gained. An Aero King Cobra based on it was developed, but canceled after 3 prototypes were built. Power was down for the mid-range engines of 1971. The 351 Windsor was at 240 horsepower, and the 351 Cleveland 285, which became the standard engine on the Cobra. With the restyle of 1972, the Torino GT became the Grand Torino Sport, and the Cobra was discontinued. Engines mostly carried over, but the move to the net ratings had the advertised numbers down. 140 for the 302, 161 for the 351 Windsor, and 208 for the 429. There was a new 6.6-liter 400, rated at 168 horsepower, but the performance option was the 351 Cobra Jet, based on the Cleveland and offering 248 horsepower net, meaning it was still a mid-15-second car, with a top speed near 130. Horsepower would only fluctuate slightly going forward, but cars would keep getting heavier, and 1974 would see the end of the Sport and the 351 Cleveland. And the 220 horsepower 460 that replaced the 429 was hardly a performance engine, being marketed more towards towing, and it was only offered with an automatic, making it a low 17-second car. Mercury introduced the Cyclone in 1964 as the performance version of the compact Comet. No slouch, it was powered by a 210 horsepower 4.7-liter 289 for a mid-16-second quarter mile and speeds over 110. But in 1966, the Comet essentially became the same car as the Ford Fairlane, and the Cyclone had a standard 390 with 265 horsepower, an optional 275 horsepower version, and the Cyclone GT with 335 horsepower, which was also available with an automatic as the Cyclone GTA. For 1967, the base engine was reduced to a 210 horsepower 289. The FE429 was offered in the base Comet as an option, but not in the Cyclone, except as a rare dealer-installed option. With the restyle of 1968, the Comet became the Montego, but the Cyclone carried over. The base 289 was replaced by a 302 with 210 to 230 horsepower, and the 390 in the Cyclone GT was offered in 265 to 325 horsepower, and the 335 horsepower 428 Cobra Jet would become optional. There was some reshuffling for 1969. The 302 had 220 horsepower, the new 351 Windsor 250 to 290 horsepower, and the 390 in the GT had 320, but 325 in the new Cyclone spoiler. But there was also a new Cyclone Spoiler 2 aimed at NASCAR. It included an aero treatment and was offered in either Cale Yarborough Special or Dan Gurney Special with red or blue trim. And although the racing versions used an engine based on the 429 Boss, the street version had a standard 351 Windsor with a column shift automatic. The 335 horsepower 428 carried over, but was now its own model as the Cyclone Cobra Jet. The cars were restyled again for 1970, but packages got a bit confusing. The base Cyclone used a 429 with 360 gross horsepower, or 250 net. The optional 370 gross horsepower, or 305 net horsepower 429 Cobra Jet was standard on the Cyclone spoiler, which also included a tach, 140 mile-an-hour speedometer, and bucket seats, and optionally had the 375 gross horsepower, or 335 net horsepower, 429 Super Cobra Jet, and drag pack limited slip differential. While the Cyclone GT was much better equipped overall, but the standard engine was a 351 with 250 to 300 gross horsepower. The planned Spoiler 2 never made it into production. With the restyle of 1972, the Cyclone was no longer its own model. becoming the Montego GT and Montego GT Cyclone, offered with either a 248 net horsepower 351 Cobra jet or a 205 horsepower 429, with a total of 30 being made, spelling the end of the Cyclone. Dodge came into the muscle car arena strong in 1966 with the new limited production Charger. Based on the Coronet, it had aero styling as well as a distinct interior, starting just over $3,100. The standard engine was a rather mundane 5.2-liter 318 with 230 horsepower, but options climbed quickly through a 5.9-liter 361, 6.3-liter 383, 7-liter 426 Hemi, and 7.2-liter 440, with horsepower ranging from 265 to 425, with the Hemi being capable of a mid to high 13-second quarter mile and speeds near 150 miles an hour. It was joined the next year by the Coronet RT, or Road and Track, that started around $3,200, offering engines not available in lesser Coronets, starting with a base 375 horsepower 7.2-liter 440 Magnum, making it a low 14-second car, and for an additional $900, got an optional 425 horsepower 7-liter 426 Street Hemi. But the Coronet RT and Charger combined amounted to less than 30,000 cars, both of which would be restyled for 1968, and the overall shape was much more similar. As the Charger moved somewhat down market, it gained an RT package of its own, but the Charger was still quite distinct with its unique hidden headlight grille, while the base Charger was reduced to a 3.7-liter 225/6. But the new styling proved to be much more popular, and overall Charger sales were 3 times what was planned for the year, nearly reaching 100,000. And the Coronet RT would be joined by the slightly cheaper Super B, with a standard 335 horsepower 383, and the Charger instrument cluster. But it too could be had with a 426 Hemi, putting it well into the 13-second range. For 1969, there were a couple of noteworthy changes, including the introduction of the Charger 500, an attempt to make the Charger RT more aerodynamic than it was in its standard form. Changes included a flush-mounted rear window, and the Coronet grille pushed to the front edge of the bumper, except on the Charger Daytona, improving the aerodynamics of the Charger 500. It gained an 18-inch nose cone and a 2.5-foot wing for NASCAR dominance, while the Super B introduced a 446-pack. Equipped with 3 two-barrel carburetors, it produced 390 gross horsepower, making it a 14-second car. An engine that would make it into the Charger and Coronet RT for 1970, each receiving a facelift, with the Coronets being more extensive with a new split grille. But with the restyled cars of 1971, the Coronet was only offered as a 4-door, and the RT was gone. The Super B name carried on, but was now a package on the new Charger, which was offered with an optional rear spoiler and Ramcharger pop-up scoop. Engines carried over, with the addition of a 275 gross horsepower 5.6-liter 340. 1972 models saw some shuffling, including the move to net horsepower ratings, which had the Slant 6 at 110, the 318 was down 5 to 150, the 340 was 240, and the 440 was down 25 to 280. The 383 was replaced by a bigger 6.6-liter 400 with 190 to 255 horsepower, which was actually up 5. But the 446-pack and the Hemi were discontinued. The RT package was replaced by the Rally package, and there was a new SE package that included a formal roof and hidden headlights, which were otherwise optional. The Super B name was dropped after the end of the year, although it would be used on a version of the B8 Demon in some export markets through 1976. For 1974, the 340 was replaced by a 5.9-liter 360, but in the Charger, output was down to 200, and they would be restyled for 1975, with a more formal look to better compete with Chevy's Monte Carlo, offered in Special Edition or SE, and the revived Daytona, being an appearance package. Engines included the 318, the 360, which was down to 180 to 190 horsepower, and a torquier 190 horsepower 400. 1976 added the Charger Sport, which was really just a two-door Coronet, being the last year of the Coronet. But the 400 would get a performance option, bumping power back up to 240. In 1978, the Charger was replaced by the Magnum, although the two cars would overlap, and the Magnum was effectively the same car, just with a facelift, itself only lasting 2 years, before the name was used on an updated version of the Dart for export markets. Plymouth introduced its gentleman's muscle car in 1967 with the Belvedere-based GTX, offered with a base 375 horsepower Super Commando 440 or an optional 426 Hemi, making for a low 14 or mid-13 second quarter mile, only to be restyled as a bigger, heavier, and more curvaceous car for 1968, at which point it was joined by what was essentially a stripper version, sold as the Roadrunner, so stripped down that even roll-down rear windows were an option, and the base engine was reduced to a 335 horsepower 383. But it did include decals and a horn based on the Looney Tunes Roadrunner cartoon character. And the $2,900 Roadrunner quickly stole sales from the $500 more expensive GTX, just over $45,000 compared to just under $20,000. For 1969, the Roadrunner gained an optional 390 horsepower 6-barrel version of the 440 and a vacuum-actuated air grabber air intake. A facelift for 1970 added available front disc brakes and a fake side scoop, and an aero package similar to Dodge's Daytona as the Superbird Roadrunner. The 440 6-pack became available on the GTX, but its sales continued to decline. The cars would be restyled for 1971, getting Chrysler's more muscular fuselage styling. Drivetrain changes included the addition of a 300 horsepower version of the 383 in the Roadrunner, and the 440 4-barrel was down 5 horsepower to 370 gross, or 305 net. For 1972, the 440 6-pack and the 426 Hemi were gone, and the GTX became an options package on the Roadrunner instead of being its own model. The 340 was rated at 240 horsepower, and the new 400 at 255, and the 440 280 with the move to net ratings. Safety regulations forced a facelift for 1973, and the GTX option was discontinued. But even with the added weight, the Roadrunner could still be a sub-15-second car. The cars were restyled for 1975, and the 440 was dropped, leaving a 235 horsepower 400 as the top engine, but only with an automatic. Being even heavier than the previous car, it now took 17 seconds to do the quarter mile. In 1976, the Roadrunner name would be moved to the performance version of the new compact Volare, available with the 318 or 360, horsepower range from 140 to 170, making it a fraction quicker than the outgoing car. Power was up to 195 for 1979, but it became an appearance package, available even on the base Slant 6 Volare. And the 360 was dropped for 1980, leaving the 155 horsepower 318 as the top engine in its last year. AMC even got into the act. In fact, some would argue that the 1957 Rambler Rebel was actually the first muscle car. Powered by a 215 horsepower 5.4-liter 327 in a lightweight package, it made for a 17-second sedan. And the Rebel name would be revived for the new mid-size models of 1967. And mid-year 1968, it would gain a new 315 horsepower 7.2-liter 390 as an option in the high-level SST package. But the real muscle came in 1970 with The Machine, adding special heads, valve train, cam, intake, and exhaust. Output of the 390 was bumped to 340 horsepower, and it had a distinct hood scoop and red, white, and blue decal package. It was a high 14-second car with a top speed near 120, but it was only offered for 1 year with less than 2,000 sold. The following year, the Rebel was replaced by the Matador, and the muscle car option became the Machine Go package. The engines were a 5.9-liter 360 and 6.6-liter 401 with 285 or 330 horsepower, but only 50 were made. These wouldn't be the last muscle cars, but high costs, high insurance premiums, and the fuel crisis effectively put an end to the original muscle car era. So as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.